This is from an address that I gave at the Yom HaShoah 2021 ceremony in Perth, Australia. Our parents don't die. They live on in the stories that they leave behind, and I'm here to tell you two stories, that of my darling late mother, Henny Kagan Hittner, and my dear aunt, Reza Kagan Silbert, who is 91 and lives here in Perth. My mother and Reza were born in Memel, Lithuania, which is now known as Klaipėda, and along with their older brother Hessel, lived with their parents, my Boba and Zeta, Tuvia and Irla Kagan. They had a nice, comfortable, middle-class life. My Zeta had a Geschäft, a business. He owned some apartments. They were observant. They kept kosher. They spoke Yiddish and German at home. And during the 1930s, life was quite optimistic. My mother had a gift for languages, but was very surprised and, I believe, protested bitterly when at age 10, my Boba sent her to night school to learn English. With an uncanny prescience, my Boba Irla, for whom I am named, insisted that Henny may need to speak English in a time of danger. In June 1941, Lithuania had a population of between 200,000 to 250,000 Jews, but by the end of the war, over 190,000 of them had been murdered, not only by the Germans, but also by their own fellow Lithuanian citizens who reveled in slaughtering their friends and neighbors. The annihilation of Lithuanian Jewry was virtually complete. In March 1939, the Kagan family fled from Memel to Kovno, which today is known as Kaunas, because my Zeta had been stripped of all his assets. They were appropriated. But in June 1941, the German killing squads, or Einsatzgruppen, marched into Kovno and immediately started mass murdering Jews. On the 25th of June 1941, there was a knock at the door. SS guards and their enthusiastic Lithuanian collaborators came for Tuvia, my Zeta, and my uncle Hessel, who was only 17 at the time. They were taken to a barracks, the infamous 7th Fort, which was garrisoned by Lithuanian auxiliary police units, where they and hundreds of fellow Jews were shot and killed. Fathers had to bury sons, and sons had to bury their fathers. Their crime? They were born Jewish. On July 15, 1941, all the Jews in Kovno were forced at gunpoint to go into the ghetto, where they were sealed in, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, and forced to wear a yellow star. When my grieving Boba and her two young daughters, aged 15 and 12, were driven out of their home, they managed to bundle up a few possessions, and then they requisitioned a cart with a driver to take them into the ghetto, whilst their Lithuanian neighbors laughed and jeered at them. Only their little dog Zhushka ran after the cart, crying, howling. Life in the Kovno ghetto was absolutely intolerable. My Boba and mother were used as slave laborers, and they were forced to help build a military base. They'd be taken out early in the morning under guard, and then returning home late in the evening, exhausted and starving. Reza, who was underage and undernourished, was considered too small to be used as a slave, and so she remained behind in the ghetto along with other children, left to their own devices. Reza, a child herself, would witness unbelievable cruelties, barbaric acts that no child, nobody, should ever have to see. She saw babies taken from their mother's arms and thrown against the side of military trucks, or was forced to watch SS guards taking two babies and bashing their heads together for fun, for sport. Out of 29,000 Jewish prisoners in the Kovno Ghetto, only 3,000 eventually survived. Now, here's where the sister's story become two separate histories. On the 20th of October 1943, some 1,600 children were rounded up and murdered in what was known as a Kinderaktion in the Kovno Ghetto. A few of the remaining children were part of a selection program. They were herded onto cattle trains, no food, no water, standing room only, and deported to various concentration and extermination camps in Northern Europe. Riza was one of those children. When Irla, Aboba, and Henny returned to the ghetto that night, Riza was gone, and once again, mother and daughter sat shiver. Riza arrived at a child slave labor camp in Estonia called Rival, and there she was beaten by SS guards. She was made to chop wood, to pull railway trucks. She contracted typhus, and they literally broke her back. From her group of forced child slaves, only 4 girls survived. With the Allied armies advancing, in July 1944, the Nazis decided to raze and burn down the Kovno Ghetto, so as to destroy all traces of their evil. Over 2,000 people were burned alive. The remainder of prisoners were sent to concentration camps. My Bobber and mother landed up in Stutthof, which is a village near Danzig. Today it's known as Gdansk. And Stutthof was Poland's first extermination camp, and it also became the last one to be liberated in 1945. There aren't enough words in the English language to describe the hell of Stutthof. The crematoria burned bodies day and night. The smell of burning flesh pervaded the air, and although they denied it, all the Polish citizens who lived near the camp inhaled this dreadful smell every day, and they never acknowledged or did anything about it. Some of the villagers even worked in the Stutthof camp. They shot, tortured, killed Jews during the day, and then crossed the fields to return to their own homes at night, where they'd have dinner with their families, perhaps do some homework with their children. Maybe they settled down to listen to beautiful recordings of Beethoven and Bach. And then, the next day, they would come back to Stutthof camp to murder more Jews. But then came a miracle. When the Soviet army began advancing through Estonia in October 1944, the Rival slave camp in Estonia was evacuated by the SS. Well, they wanted to destroy all evidence. And many prisoners were sent to other concentration camps in Poland and Germany. Riza somehow landed up in Stutthof. In Stutthof, having lost everyone and everything, they even lost their names. No identity. Henny and Riza simply became a number. They were ciphers. This is my mother's concentration camp number. This is the actual fabric that was sewn onto the rags that she was forced to wear, and her number was 42027. Riza's camp number was 71276. And every day there was an appel, a roll call, and they had to respond to these numbers. When they met up again, their reunion was indescribable, literally returned from the dead. But, sadly, their joy was very short-lived. Starving, emaciated, bitterly cold, and suffering from typhus, Maboba Irla Kagan passed away on the 25th of January, 1945. Stutthof concentration lager was a killing field. There were so many corpses. Not all of them could be cremated in the crematoria. So a crematory pyre was built, very close to where the Jewish prisoner barracks were situated, and Russian prisoners of war, who were also incarcerated at Stutthof, were detailed to clear away the rotting bodies, piled up like logs of wood, just cartloads of human refuse. When their mother died, Henny and Reza begged the man who came to take her away not to leave her out in the snow and the cold. And that night, as the two girls watched the crematory fire, they prayed that their mother was part of the smoke. My mother would tell me that if she ever had to write a book, she would call it The Dead Were My Friends, as every time there was an action in the camp, when Jews were summarily shot for fun on a daily basis, she and Reza would run and hide under a pile of corpses. Some of the corpses were still writhing. They hadn't yet met their final moments, crawling with maggots and lice. And this is where these two girls hid from the guards. Conditions in the camp were so horrific that, in fact, many prisoners would just go insane. They would throw themselves onto the electric fencing around the barracks. And in some parts of the camp, cannibalism was rife. And then came the Allies. With the end of the war in sight, the Nazis began to destroy and eliminate all traces of their murderous regime, and orders were given to liquidate Stutthof. Not to release their inmates, but to force the few hundred remaining prisoners on a death march under armed guards to the Baltic Sea. Somehow, against all the odds, between the 28th of April to the 3rd of May 1945, Henny and Reza survived this nightmarish ordeal. But most of their fellow prisoners simply gave up. Those who couldn't walk or move any further were shot as they fell down. They were beaten by hunger, by exhaustion. They simply had no will to carry on. When they reached Hafkrug on the shores of the Baltic, they were herded onto large barges and shoved out to sea. And still, there were SS troops on the shore shooting at them, as additional guards boarded the barges with the prisoners and shot them at point-blank range. Whether by drowning or shooting, these murderous troops were hell-bent on destroying any evidence of their sadism. You know, when you look at seawater, it's usually a glorious turquoise or sometimes a brooding navy grey. But the water around these barges in the Baltic were red with blood. My mother realized that they only had one chance to survive, by jumping into the water. But Reza had never learned to swim. And in fact, she was ill. She was beyond all attempts to try and keep herself alive. She was just 15. And she begged my mother to leave her behind on the barge. She said, Los mir allein hinne, los mir gehen, los mir zurück, leave me. But my mother put Reza on her back, jumped into the bloody water, and somehow, we'll never know what strength, what courage it took to swim, to doggy paddle, However she did it, she reached the shore, but not to safety. When they straggled ashore, there again were Gestapo guards waiting to round them up, march them back to Neustadt, where yet again they wanted to put them out to sea to drown. And suddenly, in the midst of all this chaos, they heard the sound of approaching tanks. And immediately, the SS guards just disappeared. Mom and Riese were surrounded by uniformed soldiers with raised rifles. And one of the officers, thinking that these two walking skeletons were German, demanded in English that they raise their hands. And Mom replied in English, "Don't shoot, we're concentration camp prisoners." And that is where my Boba Irla's prophetic wisdom in sending my mother to learn English at night school came to save their lives. My mother told her story to these British soldiers, and they were taken immediately into British military protection, where they were given food and medical aid, and they were restored to life. We, my brother Trevor Hittner, my sister Dana Gordon, and Riese's son Philip Silbert, we are the result of the strength and perseverance of these two remarkable women over indescribable evil. We children of Holocaust survivors are the listeners. We have become their truth tellers because some of them are no longer here to tell their stories. Our job is to be the container of their testimonies, their memories, and in all cases, their pain. We've listened to our parents' stories, and for those who listened, often there was a silence filled with so much sorrow, with so much anguish. Even as kids, we somehow knew that darkness lurked and that we couldn't intrude on their personal ghosts. The word silent is an anagram of listen. We cannot afford to be silent any longer. Now it's incumbent on us, on you, and on future generations to keep repeating their stories. You need to raise your voices whenever and wherever you can, as we keep reiterating, never again. Friends, across the world, in academia, in the media, and sadly even in our own Australian political arena, the dark cloud of vicious anti-Semitism is already descending. We have a situation today where the malevolent are preaching to those who are naive, who haven't learnt from the lessons of history. And those venal forces are determined yet again to silence our Jewish voices. You know, my mother used to warn us as kids that we Jews are never safe from this age-old hatred. She'd say, "Kinderlach, kommt," it's coming. I think if she were alive today, she would say, "Erido, it's here." About 36 years ago, I was babysitting our son, and I was seized by an imperative to write a poem. I felt possessed. The words just tumbled out, and it only took about 10 minutes to write, and I've never changed a single syllable since. It's called Poem for Irla, Stutthof, January 1945. My mother found her mother naked and dead atop a pile of corpses. And later on in the day, as the frosty hours dragged towards night, she saw a wisp of smoke, silent and sure, rising upwards, reaching ever higher on its way to immortality. She asked herself, whose soul is this that hovers midway in the sky? And the poor lingered, as if reluctant to travel on. until she pressed her face to the icy glass and slowly raised her hand to say goodbye. We Jews are not numbers. We will never go up in smoke again. We have names. I'm Ilana Hittner Klavansky, daughter of Henny and Jack Hittner, granddaughter of May and Harry Hittner, and Irla and Tevye Kagan. They will not be forgotten. We've survived against the odds from generation to generation. We remember the past, but we look ahead to giving life to the future. And that's why we always say, L'chaim, to life. Thank you.